Muddy trenches, endless stalemate, an Anglo-French alliance after years of tricky relations, and a painfully sluggish United States. Well, it's no wonder that the war in Ukraine is so often compared to the First World War, and particularly to the Western Front. But that isn't to say that the war is old hat either, as in so many ways, geopolitical and military, it is positively novel. So as common as they are, how accurate are these comparisons? And perhaps more importantly, are they even helpful to begin with, or worse, could they even be outright counterintuitive? To start with, let's take an example of a trench assault as recorded by the Chosen Company, an international volunteer unit with the Ukrainian army. At its very start, the footage features the men rapidly approaching the position from a vehicle and taking small arms fire. They disembark, one of them notably with a bayonet fixed, and they rush to cover where they immediately employ suppressive fire and begin throwing grenades. Once they enter the Russian trench, they continue to use pretty quintessential First World War bombardier tactics, tossing grenades around corners to clear the enemy before rushing in with small arms to take the position. Now, if you'd like to see that footage yourself, I'll link it in the description down below, but for our purposes, I suffice to say that there are obviously comparisons to be made here with the trench warfare of the Western Front, and no doubt a tactical awareness of how old-school trench raids would take place would obviously prove helpful to any soldier tasked with carrying a Russian trench today. And for that matter, when you look at some of the satellite photos of those Russian trench networks, again, you can see where these comparisons are coming from. I mean, they aren't exactly a one-to-one. For example, there's obviously not as much of a need for communications trenches these days when we have things like internet and radio communications, but in the bigger scheme, a lot of the same principles are at play here. But the Western Front was marked by more than just trench fighting. Indeed, for much of the war, there was a marked lack of mobility, a multi-year stagnation at the front. And while I don't know how the actual numbers of mobility could compare here, well, from the distant perspective of a civilian, it certainly feels like the Ukraine war is endless sometimes. The war has been going on since 2014, and the full-scale Russian invasion was already more than 3 years ago. For perspective, the First World War was 4¼ years long. But despite the initial strong Russian offensive that threatened the Ukrainian capital before ultimately being pushed back, which incidentally is another similarity to the Western Front, well, somehow in 2025, Russia is making even fewer territorial gains this year than they ever did prior. And while they may be pushing back the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk, well, they seem to be simultaneously losing ground to a new one in Belgorod, where Ukraine has just confirmed a few days ago that they have troops present. It all certainly feels like a brutal stalemate at the front, Russians dying in droves for every little smidge of ground gained, so much so that they need to be relying on, shall we say, international volunteers for a war of conquest. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are refusing to back down no matter how bad things seem to get. Of course, when it comes to the exact nature of the war and the condition of both the front lines and, in fact, the home front on either side, it can be hard to make comparisons to a historical event because, well, of course, these events are ongoing and the fog of war convolutes it all. It's not like anyone is just going to be broadcasting their war plans to random reporters. But thankfully, as you've already seen I've been using them for this video, today's sponsor, Ground News, is a great way to help cut through that fog. Because rather than just giving me a single report from a single perspective, Ground News collates news articles from all over the world and brings them together in one place. That way, I can quickly compare article headlines and better understand how different biases might be at play over the news that I'm consuming. I can also use Ground News to see how factual the various sources are that are doing that reporting, and I can even see who runs those news sources, whether they're independent news or whether they're owned by large international media conglomerates, or even whether they are state-owned media by a variety of different governments. I've said it before, but in our unprecedented times, information is cheap while the truth has a real premium. And that's why I think that ground news is so valuable. If, for example, I want to figure out what's actually going on in Belgorod, like, are the Ukrainians really there? Is it impressive? Is it important that they're there? Is it not a big deal? What's going on, all that? Well, I can see at a glance who is talking about it and what their political slant might be, and that's obviously going to be impacting the way that they are framing these different events. When it comes to military history, and especially modern-day military actions, obviously there are going to be 1.5 million different slants on 1.5 million different issues. And so trying to cut through all of that can be difficult. And again, that's what makes ground news, in my opinion, so valuable. So when you use the link down below, groundnews.com/Brandon, or you can simply scan the QR code here, you can get up to 40% off of their Vantage plan, the highest tier subscription, making it only $5 per month. So thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video, and in that I don't often talk about modern day events in making my videos, thank you also to Ground News for helping to make it possible and helping to teach me about what's going on in Ukraine. And so with that, wow, it really does seem like the situation in Ukraine is just like the Western Front, right? Well, I can end my video right here, nice and short and sensationalist. I can pocket my YouTube cash and walk away clean, right? Well, not quite. Because you see, for every similarity between the two conflicts, there are also striking differences. Now sure, elements of the trench assault felt very much like World War I, but the means by which the troops reached that trench is anything but. I mean, Haig would kill for those kinds of armored troop carriers. And yes, one trench system might look very Western Front, but there are plenty of others, of course, that, based upon where they are being deployed and how they are intended to be used, are far more distinctly modern. This network, for example, being intended, it looks like to me, to resist an armored spearhead that had fit far more in line with the Second War than with the First. Or look at this position, which is almost the exact opposite, consisting of strong points all strung together to reinforce one another while also retaining a tactical independence, which is a theme very common across early modern fortifications. For a fitting example, the Russian works at Poltava, among, again, so many hundreds of others, look kind of similar. Meanwhile, in other military examples, I think, for example, of how artillery is functioning in both of these wars, and how, on the one end, well, yes, we can easily compare how both of these conflicts are so artillery-reliant. Yet, the First World War was one of massed battery fire with literally hundreds of millions of shells, what we would today call dumb shells, being hurled against each other to varying effect. While the Ukraine war is very different. It's seeing smart precision shells, which are much more expensive and difficult to manufacture, being fired in the mere millions, as self-propelled artillery is employing a shoot-and-scoot method in a more fluid, more flexible kind of artillery duel. And this is all to say nothing, of course, of the regular missile strikes that would make the Paris gun blush, while drone warfare seems to be revolutionizing modern warfighting, potentially even more so than the tank or the aeroplane. Politically speaking as well, while we can obviously make comparisons in very broad terms, well, the more specific we get, the more varied all of the causes and sustaining elements of the two conflicts become. The First World War was one of extreme parity, in which nearly the whole world was directly involved. Meanwhile, Russia, once thought of as the world's second most powerful military, a laughable claim now, but they once were, they haven't been able to defeat a single neighbor that prior to the conflict, basically everyone thought would collapse within 3 days' time. And rather than, because everyone is so evenly matched, rather than draining the Western powers of entire generations of young men and costing entire national wealths, Ukraine has kept up the fight largely on their own, with only comparatively limited financial and material aid, large portions of which are really just outdated equipment that NATO nations were in the process of replacing anyways. So my point is that this is hardly a global conflict between, powers in parity with one another. Now, of course, I could keep rambling on like this, comparing and contrasting the two conflicts forever. But, we could also do the same thing for so many other conflicts besides. For example, one article for foreignpolicy.com argues that the war is much more akin to the Second War than the First, and even more explicitly than that, they say to Normandy in 1944. But I say we go deeper. Yes, let's look to the American War for Independence, a classic on this channel, right? After all, we have a smaller, less industrialized, less wealthy society holding out against a much larger, larger in terms of economy and military and whatnot, not in terms of physical size, obviously. Whatever. In terms of a stronger, on paper, power, and in which resistance, of course, the American colonies began receiving international support after demonstrating that they had a little bit more bite than Europe ever expected prior. The American War also featured trench lines and redoubts, alongside a few amphibious landings, and even a daring naval raid that accomplished far more than anyone would ever have thought possible, unless, I guess, like the British, some British sailor just dropped a cigarette or whatever silly excuse that they used that day. So whoa, after all that, is the war in Ukraine really a new kind of American war for independence? Yeah, sure, why not, right? My point is that while these kinds of comparisons can be interesting and they can help us to better understand certain specific elements of individual conflicts, they're never a one-to-one, and they can obviously go a little too far. The thing is that we can draw these lines however we want. So long as you know enough about one topic and are willing to cherry pick your way through enough about another topic, well, then you can make any two things seem very much alike, right? When it comes to Ukraine, sometimes it feels like people will just look at a singular element, in this case the presence of a trench network, and they'll exclaim, "Oh my goodness, it's just like World War I!" We do the same thing with the American Civil War, or the Second Boer War. Oh look, they have trenches! It's a proto-Western front! Even the way that the Maori fortified their villages in the 19th century has certain similarities with First World War defensive doctrine. And I've seen people go so far back as like the Battle of Alesia, for example, because it featured a kind of no man's land between Caesar and the Gauls. So, oh my gosh, it's World War I guess. The lesson here isn't that the First World War was the epitome of trench warfare, towards which all trenches prior were leading and from which every hole in the ground is a corruption. Rather, it's that trenches themselves are just one of the most common forms of military fortification throughout history. The concept of a trench and how it's employed has shifted and altered from setting to setting based on the context within which the trenches were used. The Western Front, then, was surely a highly unique context, but it isn't some Socratic ideal of trench warfare at its purest. It was just another particularly brutal instance thereof. It's sort of like when I discussed how not every use of rapid movement in warfare constitutes a blitzkrieg, whatever that means. Which, between the two here, blitzkrieg and trench warfare, having these be the things that we compare everything to implies a kind of hierarchy of warfare at which the two world wars are oftentimes at the very top. Another great example is how it seems like every single time a large military gets bogged down fighting an insurgent guerrilla war, it immediately gets compared, at least in American parlance, to Vietnam. I mean, was the war in Afghanistan another Vietnam? What about the Second Boer War, or the Peninsular War, or the Romans in Germany? I mean, there are similarities, but again, the narrative is starting to get away from us a little bit here, don't you think? Every collection of facts and beings and movements, or whatever you want to describe it as, that we define as events are a direct result of those which came before them, which is why the study of history is so important. But these events are also defined by their present unique context. History is an amazing tool for understanding our present world, but like every tool, it's also flawed, it's limited. As such, it's important that we employ it in its proper place, as with every tool. For just as history as a totality is inherently unknowable, so too is the totality of the present day unknowable. The only thing that we can really do is to learn more, to scrape away at the stone veil of ignorance with the tools available to us. An assortment of those tools are history, philosophy, mathematics, and every other field of study. Come to think of it, actually, that would have been a great place to also plug the Ground News sponsorship, because that's the entire point, is learn as much as you possibly can about what everyone is saying to try and get a better sense of the reality of a situation. Again, link below, only $5 a month when you use the code and all that. You'll find it down below. But anyways, none of this is to say, right, that comparing and contrasting is useless in history. Indeed, I think that much can be gained through the use of this specific tool, and there's a reason why it represents one of the first things that we all learn to do in grade school. It's just also important, right, that as our knowledge grows, we don't just continue to employ these tools in the same way that we were first taught, but rather we refine those tools. We make them more precise and acknowledge their limitations as well. I mean, I've been tutoring my kid sister lately in her history class, and the number of compare and contrast the Roman Republic with our oh-so-perfect American democratic checks and balances questions that we have seen makes me roll my eyes, to say the absolute least. And in the case of the war in Ukraine, comparisons to the First World War often serve to represent it as a pointless meat grinder, of which, of course, the Great War wasn't one of those either. It's just how it's often portrayed, I think. And that version of comparing and contrasting, in that it is so simplistic, I think, it often gives far less credit to the people of Ukraine than they deserve, as they fight to preserve their sovereignty and their lives. It's a version of events that is beneficial to one side and actively detrimental to the other. That's the thing, is that this isn't just a curiosity amongst us history nerds. These narratives, both historical and modern, have very real practical applications. And again, while comparison can be a very helpful way to better understand them, if we rely on comparison too heavily, it can just as easily become a set of blinders by which we are oversimplifying events and missing out on what makes them so unique as well as so familiar feeling. So, the war in Ukraine, is it just like the First World War? Well, there are certainly similarities, and those similarities are worth exploring, but no, it certainly isn't another First World War, and I think that we would do well to mind such hyperbole in the future. Now, before you go, I've got a quick little change up to how I'd like to end these videos. I thought it might be fun to start showcasing some viewers' artwork after every video, starting with this fantastic composition that was actually put together in a video game by viewer Sketchman91 in anticipation of my upcoming historical fiction novel, The Corpse War of 1793. And actually, this scene isn't all that different from a one that actually does take place in the book, which given that the book hasn't come out yet, is a pretty good way to tell me that I think I'm on the right track with it. Now, you'll find the link to this piece down below if you'd like to check out any of Sketchman's other work. And if you yourself happen to have any artwork, be it related to my channel directly or just generally historical, that you'd like to share, well, please do email it over to brandonf@nativeoak.org, and I'd love to feature it at the end of a future video. Thank you all for watching, of course, and a special thank you to the patrons for their continued support of my work, including our two new patrons, Patrick and Lord Wungler Beckett himself. And until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.